Did you know that the Northwoods Kindred isn't just a podcast? We are a living, breathing kindred with all kinds of helpful stuff all over the web. Now, we've made it super easy and convenient for you to stalk us by putting everything that we have into one easy to find location. In the description below, we added our link tree, and that'll take you to everything that we have all over the net. I hope that helps. Þórr viki, my friends. Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to the Northwoods Kindred podcast. I'm Bodvarr, the chieftain and Gothi of the Northwoods. And today I'm going to read another story, and this is an interesting one because this is a story that not everybody gets to. Now, a lot of people read some of the main stories about some of the main gods here and there, but this one isn't one that everybody has a chance to read, and I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because they lose enthusiasm for it before they get this far, but it's one of the foundational stories, and it's really kind of the point where Loki actually comes into the real. It's like the beginning of Loki's involvement with the pantheon. It's kind of interesting, and at this particular point of this story, Loki isn't necessarily the trickster that we know him to be later on as his personality evolved through the Norse pantheon. Now, what I'm going to be reading is the building of the wall of Asgard, and by default talking about Loki gifting Sleipnir to Odin as well. Now, the cool thing about the book that I'm reading it out of is that there's some kind of cliff notes at the end, so once I'm done with the story, I'll go back and I'll read the end cliff notes as well. But we're going to be telling it out of the Norse Myths by Kevin Crossley-Holland. And it was copyright 1980, but the one I'm reading out of is a reprint from 1987. And I don't know what the 1980 book looks like, but the 1987 has a bright red jacket, but it's really cool because once you open the book, on the inside there's a yellow page, and it has like this really cool map of the world tree, and it has like all the little creatures and stuff around it, and it kind of lays out all the 9 worlds. But then it has these little passages all over the inside of the jacket, like the chosen men, the gods and goddesses, the dwarves, the best of treasures, the towering giants, the shining halls, and the worst of monsters. And it just kind of lays out like these little bulleted lists of this is all the monsters, this is all the gods, this is all the da. And it doesn't cover all the gods, but just about 8 or 9 of them, the main characters that you'll read in most of the stories. But it's interesting. It was worth mentioning. Anyway, that's the Norse Myths by Kevin Crossley-Holland. This is the reprint from 1987, and we're going to be talking about the building of the wall of Asgard. Let me get a little bit of housekeeping out of the way, and then we'll get into the story. Did you know that Gija Skogel and I have a small business called Survival Hardware, LLC? We are dedicated to handcrafting heirloom quality goods. Real handmade products like knives, jewelry, and rich leather goods. All of our products are made with love and care right here in our Idaho shop and are sure to be among your most prized articles. If you sign up for the newsletter when you get there, we'll get a 10% discount in your email off of the entire site for your first purchase. So fill up your cart, enjoy American-made products that'll last several lifetimes, and a 10% discount just for being awesome. Explore the site when you're there because we also have some free and cheap digital downloads that are sure to enrich your pagan practices. And more are being added all the time. Our link tree is in the description below. You asked for it, so we did it. Northwoods Kindred now has some amazing swag that we created just for our tribesmen. We have branded specialty shirts, tote bags, coffee cups, and even our signature NWK bucket hats. No more tired old Viking designs pillaged from the net. These are high quality products that you can only get by visiting our Teespring store. And most are available in a wide variety of sizes and color options. There's certainly something there to make every Norse heathen a happy camper. Link is in the link tree below. Remember, jump over to that link tree and you got access to everything we have out on the web, and some of it might appeal to you. So now let's get into the story. Long after the Golden Age, it was still very early in the cycle of time. And long after the war between the Aesir and the Vanir, the wall around Asgard that the Vanir had razed with their battle magic remained a ring of rubble, deserted, the home of eagles and ravens. The gods were anxious that the wall should be rebuilt, so that Asgard would be safe from evildoers, but none were eager to take on the heavy burden of rebuilding on their own shoulders. This is how matters stood for some time, until one day a solitary figure on horseback cantered over the trembling rainbow and was stopped by the watchman Heimdall. "I've a plan to put to the gods," said the man. You can tell it to me, said Heimdall warmly. He felt curious as he watched this man approach from 100 miles off, and smiled, showing his golden teeth. I'll tell all the gods if I tell it all, said the man from his saddle. The goddesses also may be interested. Heimdall showed his teeth again in a less friendly manner, and directed the man across the plain of Ida to Gladsheim. So the gods and goddesses gathered in Gladsheim. Their visitor tied up his stallion and stepped forward under the shining roof to the middle of the hall. He was surrounded by Odin and the 12 leading gods, each sitting in his high place, and by a throng of gods and goddesses. Odin eyed him piercingly. We are all here at Heimdall's bidding. What do you have to say? Only this, said the man. I'll rebuild your wall around Asgard. And there was a stir in Gladsheim as the gods and goddesses realized there must be rather more to the builder than met the eye. The wall will be much stronger and higher than before, said the builder, so strong and high that it will be impregnable. Asgard will be secure against the rock giants and the frost giants, even if they barge their way into Midgard. However, said Odin, aware that the conditions would soon follow. I'll need 18 months, said the builder. 18 months from the day I begin. That may not be possible, said Odin, the alert one. It is essential, said the builder. And your price? Asked Odin slowly. I was coming to that, said the builder. Freyja as my wife. The beautiful goddess sat bolt upright as she moved the necklace of the Brisings, and her golden brooches and armbands, and the gold thread in her clothing glittered and flashed. None but Odin could look directly at Freyja, fairest of goddesses, more beautiful even than Frigg and Nanna and Ygr and Sif. And as she sat erect, the outraged gods all around her were shouting or waving their arms, deriding the builder, dismissing the builder. That's impossible, shouted Odin. Let that be an end to it. I'll also be wanting the sun and the moon, said the builder. Freyja, the sun, and the moon, that's my price. Loki's voice rose out of the hubbub. Every idea has its own merits. Don't dismiss it out of hand. All the gods and goddesses turned to look at the sly one, the giant Farboti's son, and wondered what was passing through the maze of his mind. We must give this plan thought, said Loki reasonably. We owe our guest no less. So the builder was asked to leave Gladsheim while the gods and goddesses conferred, and when she saw that the gods were no longer ready to dismiss the idea out of hand, but wanted to discuss it in earnest, Freyja began to weep tears of gold. Don't be so hasty, Loki said. We could turn this plan on our own gain, supposing we give this man 6 months to build the wall. He could never build it in that time, said Heimdall. Never? Echoed many of the gods. Exactly, said Loki, and Odin smiled. So what would we lose by suggesting it, said Loki. If the builder won't agree, we lose nothing. If he does agree, he's bound to lose. Loki slapped his sides and rolled his eyes, and we'll have half our wall built free and for nothing. Although the gods and goddesses were a little uneasy about taking Loki's advice, they could see no way to fault the trickster's scheme. Indeed, several of them wished they had thought of it themselves. 6 months, said Odin, when the builder had come back into Gladsheim. If you build the wall within this time, you can have Freyja as your wife and take the sun and moon too. 6 months. The builder shook his head, but Odin continued, Tomorrow is the first day of winter. You must agree that no one will come help you. And if any part of this wall still remains unfinished, on the first day of summer you forfeit your reward. Those are our terms, and there are none other. Impossible terms, said the builder, and you know it. He paused and gazed at Freyja. But my longing, he said, my longing. He gazed at Freyja again. Then at least allow me the help of my stallion, Svadilfari. Those are our terms, said Odin. And those are mine, said the builder. Odin, you're too stubborn, protested Loki. And there are none other, said Odin firmly. What's wrong with allowing him the use of his horse? Shouted Loki. How can it possibly affect the outcome? If we refuse, there'll be no bargain, and we'll have no part of the wall at all. In the end, Loki's argument prevailed. It was agreed that the builder should begin work on the next morning and have the use of his horse. Odin swore an oath to this effect in front of many witnesses, and the builder also asked for safe conduct for as long as he worked on the wall. He said he was anxious in case Thor, who was away in the east fighting trolls at the time, should return home and fail to see matters in the same way as the other gods had done. Long before Early Waker and All Swift set off on their journey across the sky, the builder started work. By the light of the new moon, he led Svadilfari down over a sweeping grassy shoulder, past a copse, to a place where the bones of the hill were sticking out, chipped and twisted. There were huge hunks and chunks and boulders of rock there, stuff that looked as though it would last as long as time itself. The builder brought with him a loosely meshed net, which he harnessed to his stallion and spread out behind him. Then he began to heave some massive slabs onto the net. He gasped and grunted. Among the gods, only Thor could have matched his strength. After some time he had levered and piled up a great mound of rock behind Svadilfari. Then the builder gathered up the nets in his horny hands as though he were folding a sheet, and bellowed. At once Svadilfari bowed his head. He dug his shoes into the earth and began to haul. Mustering his vast strength, he dragged the whole quaking mound up the slope. And as the day dawned, the builder and his stallion, guffing in the freezing air, brought their load up beside the old broken wall of Asgard. When all the gods and goddesses stirred from their halls, they were astonished and disturbed to see how much rock Svadilfari had hauled up the hill. They watched the masons smash the boulders and shape them, and set them in place, while Svadilfari rested in the shadow of the growing wall. And such was his strength. They began to think that the mason could only be some giant in disguise. But then the gods looked at the gray circuit of broken wall that remained, and they reassured each other that they had, in any case, got the best of the bargain. Winter bared its teeth. Rossvelg beat his wings. And outside Asgard the cold wind whirled. The land was drenched by rainstorms and pelted with hailstones, then draped in snow. The giant mason and his horse gritted their teeth and worked at the wall. Night after night, Svadilfari plowed the long furrow past the copse to and from the quarry. Day after day, the mason went on building. And as the days grew longer, time for the mason and for the gods grew shorter. 3 days before the beginning of summer, the mason had almost completed the circuit of wall, cut and well-laid stone. A sturdy wall, high and strong enough to keep any unwelcome visitors at bay. Only the gateway had still to be built. The gods and goddesses were no more able to keep away from the wall than moths from a flame. They stared at it for 100th time. They talked of nothing but the bargain. Then Odin called a meeting in Gladsheim. The high hall was filled with anxious faces and fretful talk. Freyja was unable to stem her tears. The floor around her was flooded with gold. Odin raised his spear and his voice over the assembly. "We must find a way out of this contract," he shouted. "Who suggested we strike this bargain? How did we come to risk such an outcome? Freyja, married to a brute of a giant. The sky raped of the sun and the moon, so that we shall have to grope about, robbed of light and warmth." Several gods, and then every god, looked at Loki, and Odin strode across the hall floor towards him. He took a firm grip on the trickster's shoulders. "How was I to know?" protested Loki. "We all agreed." Odin tightened his grip, and Loki winced. "We all agreed," yelled Loki. "Who suggested this mason should be allowed to have the use of his horse?" Odin asked. "You got us into this trouble, and you must get us out of it." There was a shout of agreement from all the gods. "Use your warp and weft of your mind, Loki. Weave some plan. Either the mason forfeits his wages or you forfeit your life." Odin squeezed Loki's flesh and the sinews until the sly one, the shape changer, dropped to one knee. "We'll take it out of you bit by bit." Loki saw that Odin and the other gods were in deadly earnest. "I swear," he said, "no matter what it costs me, I'll see to it that the builder loses his wager." That evening the mason led Svadilfari down towards the quarry with a certain spring in his step. It seemed to him, as to the gods and goddesses, that he would finish the wall within the agreed time and win rewards, rich not only in themselves but also in the sorrow their loss would bring to the gods. He sang a kind of tune, and small birds took shelter in the gloomy copse and listened to his song. Not only the birds, a young mare pricked up her ears and listened intently. Then, when Svadilfari and the mason drew close, she sprang out of the thicket. She kicked up her heels in the air, and in the moonlight her flanks shimmered. The mare pranced up to Svadilfari. She danced around him and whisked her tail, and Svadilfari began to strain at the long rein by which the mason was leading him. Then the mare whinnied, inviting him and heading back towards the copse. Svadilfari started off after her with such a thrust that he broke the rein. He galloped behind the mare unto the copse, and the mason lumbered after Svadilfari, shouting and cursing. All night the two horses gambled, and all night the enraged mason tripped over roots and tree stumps in the half-light. He hurled abuses, he chased shadows, and in the light he began to grow green in the east before Svadilfari returned to him. So no stone was hauled from the quarry that night, and the mason had to make do with what little left over from the day before. It was not nearly enough to build the first part of the gateway, and he soon knew that he would no longer be able to complete his task on time. Then the anger churning inside the mason erupted. He burst out of his disguise and stood there before the watching gods and goddesses, a towering brute of a rock giant, in a towering rage. Now that the gods knew the builder was indeed a giant, they revoked their oaths about his safe conduct without a second thought and sent for Thor. "A trick!" shouted the rock giant. "Tricked by a gang of gods, a brothel of goddesses." Those were the mason's last words when Thor paid him his wages, and they were not the sun and the moon. A single blow from the hammer Mjolnir shattered the giant's skull into 1,000 fragments and dispatched him to the endless dark of Niflheim. A number of months passed before Loki, the shape-changer, was seen in Asgard again. And when he returned, ambling over the Bifrost and blowing a raspberry at Heimdall as he passed the Himinbjorg, he had a colt in tow. This horse was rather unusual in that it had 8 legs. He was gray, and Loki called him Sleipnir. When Odin saw Sleipnir, he admired the colt greatly. "Take him," said Loki. "I bore him, and he'll bear you. You'll find he can outpace golden and joyous, shining and swift, silver-maned and sinewy, gleaming and hollow-footed, gold-mane and light feet, and outrun whatever horses there are in Jotunheim. No horse will ever be able to keep up with him." Odin thanked Loki warmly and welcomed him back into Asgard. "On this horse you can go wherever you want," said Loki. "He will gallop over the sea and through the air. What other horse could bear its rider down the long road to the land of the dead and then bear him back to Asgard again?" Odin thanked Loki a second time and looked at the sly one very thoughtfully. What a great story. I know that some people have maybe even heard parts of it, but not the whole thing, so it's really my pleasure to bring it to you. Now, one of the beauties of this particular book, the Norse Myths by Kevin Crossley-Holland, is that he has notes in the back. So you can go to the back, and there'll be a reference to in each of those myths, there's a little bit more, I guess, just basic information about it. So let me take a quick commercial, and then I'll get back here and I'll read you the actual cliff notes for the building of the walls of Asgard. Did you know that Northwoods Kindred has a Discord channel dedicated to frith and sharing of knowledge related to the Norse pagan path? We have channels dedicated to all disciplines on this path and some of the most kind and generous heathens the world over. Are you curious how to pronounce something in Icelandic or Norse? Jump on over to the mother tongue and ask a native speaker. Still not getting it? Hop into the Well of Words with Voice and Video channel to speak face to face. Trying to work out the meaning of a difficult dream? Hop over to Dreams and Visions and get somebody else's opinion. Are you proud of something that you accomplished? Share it with the whole tribe on Braggy's Round. Experience community like only the Northwoods Kindred can bring. And of course, it is free and always will be. The link is in the link tree. Welcome to the Northwoods Kindred's online tribe. Okay, this is cliff note number 3, and it says, it's not really a cliff note. It's actually like a page and a half. The only complete version of this myth appears in Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda. A couple of stanzas in Völuspá allude to a debate among the gods about who was responsible for promising Freyja to a giant, and tell how the gods violated their oaths when Thor, swollen with rage, struck out at the giant. Snorri quotes them, but only as a kind of impromptu for his version. And some scholars think he interpreted them wrongly and that they refer to another event altogether. At all events, neither they nor a glancing reference to Loki's mother of Sleipnir in Hlendingjoth, and to Snorri's account. Snorri writes elsewhere in the Prose Edda of the time after the creation called the Golding Age, a time when gold was the metal used for every kind of making, and a time of peace and contentment before it was spoiled by the arrival of the woman who came from Giant Land. The building of Asgard's wall is then the first of the myths devoted to the anemone of the gods and giants, the theme that dominates the entire cycle and only resolves itself at Ragnarok. The gods were far from unblemished, and the giants were not totally destructive. Several gods even married giantesses. But in the end of the antagonism of the gods and the giants can only be seen as a conflict of good and evil. The gods embody aspects of natural and social order. The giants subvert that order and seek to overthrow it. The nature of their conflict shows clearly in the giant mason's price for building the wall. The idea of a bargain such as that, struck between gods and a mason, is the stuff of folklore, and parallels have been cited in which the builder is a troll or a devil, and that the penalty is sun or moon or soul. But the Mason demands not just the sun and the moon, but first of all, Freyja, most beautiful and sexually attractive of the goddesses. Freyja was one of the Vanir, the foremost goddess of fertility. The giant's intention was therefore to bring the end to the natural revolution of the seasons and deprive the gods of the possibility of regeneration, and moreover by taking away the sun and the moon to consign them to eternal freezing darkness in the bargain. This is also the first myth in which Loki comes into play. He is fully considered in the introduction. Snorri Sturluson says that Loki is called the mischief monger of the Aesir and the father of lies and the disgrace of the gods and men. It is entirely in keeping with his character in the majority of the myths, dynamic and ambivalent, that he should let the gods in for trouble, taking them into a contract about which they have no doubts, and then get them out of it again. Loki's ability to change shape is displayed in a number of myths where he assumes the form of a flea, a fly, a bird, a salmon, but he is not only a shape changer, like Odin, he can change sex, and even bear a child. In The Death of Balder, myth number 29, Loki takes the form of an old woman, and in this myth he changes himself into a mare. Bisexuality was not a characteristic that appealed to the early Icelanders, and homosexuality was a crime punishable by outlawry. It seems likely that Loki's sexual antics, even if acceptable in a god, would have aroused more distaste than amusement in the minds of believers. The fruit of Loki and Svadilfar's union is the grey Sleipnir. He has no peers and is Odin's own horse, a symbol of fertility and of death. Bones of horses have often been found in Viking burials. Sleipnir was able to journey to the world of the dead. He carried both Odin and Hermod in myths 28 and 29, and 29 is the death of Balder, and 28 is Balder's dream. His 8 legs may have suggested phenomenal speed, but they may have also suggested, as H.R. Ellis Davison said, suggested that the 8 legs of 4 mourners, or bodies and heads hidden carrying a coffin. A few other points need brief mention. Allusion to Mjolnir and the necklace of the Brising anticipate their making in myths 10 and 13, and 10 is the treasures of the gods, and 13 is the Brisingamen necklace in this book. The myths were not composed at one time, and there are inevitably a number of internal inconsistencies. The war between the Aesir and the Vanir that led to the breaking of the original wall around Asgard is subject in myth 2, which is the Aesir-Vanir War. And lastly, Ralsveig, the Corpse Eater, is a giant in eagle's guise who, according to Vafthrudismal, sits at the end of heaven overlooking hell and makes wind by flapping his wings. And that was the end of the notes on the saga by Kevin Crossley-Holland. I hope that you enjoyed that, and I hope that you subscribe to this podcast wherever you happen to be consuming it, whether it be on Spotify or one of the many, many podcast platforms that we are on. I thank you for being here, and I want to remind you, kick off your shoes, walk barefoot on the soil, get grounded, get connected, and have a wonderful life. Þórr viki.